The morning the warden's writ was nailed to my door, the wind in Dry Creek carried grit and a bitterness I could taste. I, Clara Mercer, 38, had stood behind the counter of Mercer & Co. for 15 years. First beside Thomas when he counted nails and sugar barrels, then alone, keeping accounts and tending to customers who smelled of labor and hope. The bell above the door had rung for ministers and miners, for mothers with feverish babes, and for men with coin and without. My hands knew the weight of a ledger and the shape of a teacup. I knew how to mend a torn coat, how to measure flour by feel, how to set a broken jaw until a surgeon could be found. I had skills that mattered. I had a life. I had a husband who'd been the kind of man who made promises and kept them until the year the rail cut a scar across the county and gave men like Elias Harrow the chance to buy the ambitious and sell the weakened. Thomas had been riding the supply route one wet dusk when a loaded wagon ambled too close to the cliff. He didn't come back. They told me the rope slipped, the wheel caught the shale, that men on the line were young and clumsy. I swallowed a black hollow that the county called an accident and kept the store open. I learned the names of men who came to buy bullets and flour. I learned how to stretch credit lines and to bargain for a faster delivery. Someone in town loaned me a cart and a hand when the winter froze the ribs of our small roof, but I kept the mortgage on the building and the ledger in the drawer where Thomas used to scribble. The writ was signed by the town marshal for non-payment of taxes and penalties, but the paper smelled of ink and bad fortune. Harrow's mark had been on it, the same man who owned the feedlot and the mill, who wore his money like a blunt instrument. He'd offered me a settlement once, his voice rich as dark coffee. Sell the land, take a few coins, start over somewhere else. He meant the lot where my store stood, and the acre behind it that had been Thomas's pride, where he planted a stubborn apple tree that had survived droughts and drunken nights. I had refused because Thomas had harvested more than fruit there. Refusal was dangerous in a town that kept one eye on the law and the other on the fat men who bought it. When the deputy came first, he pretended to be kind. "Miss Mercer, it's paperwork," he said, building his pity like an arsenal. He stood too close to the register, as if pity could be currency. They wanted me gone by the end of the week. The paper set a time limit on grief. It was not that I lacked cunning. I had reasoned with bookkeepers and chased down deliveries through mud. But grief had a way of narrowing your days. I was a woman in a village that offered harsh choices to women with property. Sell, marry again, or leave. The law's pen had become the lever men like Harrow used to click a machine that ground people under it. I felt small, like a moth in a jar. The first time he came through my door, he who would upend everything, he was not the swaggering outlaw the posters called Calloway. He came in like a shadow that had learned how to stand upright. He said his name was Gabriel, his voice low and unremarkable, and he asked for a loaf and a jar of salve. He carried no badge. He carried no friendliness either, only a careful manner that seemed to weigh the room. His eyes were the color of river stones, gray and steady. He did not look danger at full. He looked at it with a measuring stick, as if calculating whether he could be used to balance something unjust. He left as quickly as he'd come, but a week later, at dusk, and with rain starting its staccato on the tin roof, I was unfastening the back door for closing when I heard the crack of boots in the alley and the copper tone of a man's voice. "Looking for Calloway." That was when the first cart creaked down the main street, when a deputy with Harrow's stamp in his teeth and 3 men, tall, mean, and hungry for a name, came to my door. My breath splayed hot and ragged in the cold evening. They meant to search. They meant to take. They meant to make an example. I could have closed the door. I could have let the law in and let them pull the shelves apart. I could have watched them find tracks and lie and make a story I could not live with. But there was a thud at the cellar hatch, small and frantic. I thought of the child's hands I had dried with a rag last winter, the fingers aching to keep a fevered baby alive. I thought of Thomas's ledger in the drawer and the apple tree, the promise of roots and time. The choice came down very simply: protect what I could and lose what I could not bear to lose. So I opened the trap, slid the ladder down, and with the boldness of a woman who had nowhere else to place her courage, led a fugitive into the dim. My hand shook as I helped him down. He smelled of river, oil, old tobacco. He had a scrape at his jaw and a shirt I didn't know how to mend with thread that wasn't judgment. He looked at me with an odd, startled gratitude that did not please so much as recognize an ally. "You shouldn't have," he told me in a voice that could hold 2 truths at once, a warning and a promise. I wasn't sure what I would do with a promise from an outlaw. I only knew what I was already doing. The town could take the ledger. They could take the building. They could not take the fact that someone had slipped beneath my floor and that I had chosen to keep him there. I locked the cellar hatch myself, set a bucket for water, and told myself that this was temporary and strategic, that I had not surrendered anything in doing what I was doing. That night, as men stomped over the boards above, voices rousing with the easy cruelty of men sure their law was on their side, I sat with a lamp and the faint smell of yeast and salve, counting the goods on my shelves. I had bacon, a tinsmith's scrap of coffee, a jar of cayenne, a box of matches. I had my hands, my ledger, and a bad temper that I refused to let die. I had made a decision that would align me with an outlaw's fate, and I would wear it as carefully as one might a cloak. It would turn out months later that it would be the first stitch in a new life I would have to sew with my own hands. The cellar was not a place for secrets in a small town. It was a place for potatoes and preserved plums, for bones, and for the sort of truth that tolerated cold. But the cellar had corners, and corners make space. I left a lamp at the top of the ladder so any curious eyes would think the store closed. The bell would ring, and I would be on the porch, selling flour with a smile, while beneath my feet lay a man who had once been a headline and was now a hazard. The first days were the hardest because they were the most ordinary. I fetched water, boiled tea, sorted beans. I brought food down in a wicker basket and watched the way he ate, quick, grateful, as if he had been starved of both hunger and kindness. He was skillful in ways that had nothing to do with crime. He could whittle a spoon from a sliver of pear wood and whittle a notch that fit like a key. He had hands as precise as a locksmith's, and the patience of a man who had had to wait for the right moment to move. He could listen too, and listening is a rare skill among men who think the world must be bent to their will. He learned my schedule by walking into the store as if he owned it, and then stepping back as if apologizing for the assumption. He didn't ask for much. He patched a basket, scabbed over a shutter, tightened a hinge on the sugar box that had been rattling since the spring. In exchange, he wanted the ledger once at night, and the comforting flatness of being able to breathe without counting his days. I learned, in those first weeks, to ask careful questions. "What did you do?" I would say, and he would tell me the truth in fragments, smuggling gunpowder for a cause that had been right once, a fight with a man who had no honor left in his jaw, a killing that had been a misfire of justice. His name was Gabriel Calloway. Gabe, if you insisted on warmth. He told me about the trail that had brought him here, a stagecoach, a mistaken identity, then a sheriff who thought to make him an example. He was not boastful. He did not swagger. He told me simply about the last thing he had wanted to keep, his own code. I told him about Thomas. I had never told many people, especially not men, how the ledger had been Thomas's last act of faith, how he had tried to keep us afloat by keeping precise accounts of trust and trade. Thomas had written down debts like a confessor wrote sins. His handwriting was a map I could still read, bars by hay, sacks by name, names that meant more than coin. Gabriel read one page in the lamplight and raised a brow at a creditor I thought I had kept secret. He folded the paper as if it were a small blueprint, then pointed to the note that had set Harrow in motion. "He'll squeeze there," he said. "There's always a seam in the armor." He liked seams. Daylight brought errands, customers who needed sugar and gossip in equal parts. I treated Gabriel as if he were a stray animal that might bite, roughly polite, careful to hide my sympathy. At night, when I brought him soup and fixed his leg, I said things out loud to the empty shop the way women do when they must remind themselves of who they are. "You won't be a guest forever. You can't live under my floor and make me small. I will not be beholden." The cellar became a place of plan. I would not let a man I barely knew lie under my floor and pull me into his ruin. I intended to keep what I had and to use him as a tool if necessary. It felt like a sensible rule, a rationality I could cling to. The paradox of alliance is that respect is earned in rough ways. There was the time Harrow's men, 2 of them this time, meaner and smelling like old whiskey, came to ask after Gabriel. I was nearly ready to hand them a piece of gossip that would send them away. I wanted to be clever, to appear as if I had been fooled and then forgiven. But Gabriel insisted I do nothing. He told me, if they get a cent, they'll take everything. He meant my ledger and the store and whatever fine stubbornness was left. "You shut the door," he said. "You keep your head. Let them leave full of a story." So I did. I smiled at the deputy, kept my hands where he could see them, and served him a cup of coffee that tasted of burnt straw. I offered him a slice of salted pork and a lie about no one staying in the house. They left with pockets lined by words I had given them, nothing more. When their boots left the street, I felt the taste of victory, small, domestic, the kind of triumph you read about in female diaries from harder ages. I had not given myself away. I had not allowed their fear to dress me into shame. Gabriel, when I slid the food down the ladder later, nodded once and said, "You did good." He did not say it in praise so much as in recognition. His eyes, for all his outlaw history, had seen something in me, the way a foreman sees a woman who knows the rakes of a field. He had found not prey, but a partner. Trust shifted slowly. I kept the ledger under a cloth in a biscuit tin, and taught Gabriel how to read a dog's collar for tracks. He taught me how to breathe when a storm broke, how to steady the lantern so it didn't gutter, how to shift a plank to let a man's weight pass unnoticed. We were learning each other's skills like two people combining a recipe. He respected that I had a store to run when dawn came and a reputation to preserve. He respected that I kept my grief like a private ledger, and my temper like a weapon displayed but not always used. We were an odd union, an ex-outlaw who could make a lock sing, and a widow who could count beans by feel. We were becoming a sort of balance, uneasy and necessary. Word passed slow in a place like ours. A whisper here, a suspicious glance there. The first night they came to take the store, a legal paper held like a bludgeon, Gabriel sat in the dark of the cellar like a patient storm. When the deputies stomped their way across my floor, demanding signatures and confession, it was not a soft hand on my elbow that steadied me. It was the knowledge that someone was beneath my feet who would not let them take everything without a price. I felt less alone. I felt steeled. I matched the deputy's stare with a ledger entry and a refusal as simple as a held breath. I had accepted an alliance not because I needed a rescuer, but because I needed someone who could help make the law see the truth. He had come with scars, but he carried tools that could be used. I would teach him the ledger's language. He would teach me how to watch a man walk away. Together, we stitched a plan in the margins of the day. I would not surrender. He would not be a burden. We would survive. After the first dangerous week, when the deputies left, and when Harrow's name hummed in the town like a fly at the window, I found something I had misplaced, a steadier mirror, the practice of keeping a store, sizing up customers, remembering credit names, weighing sacks, had always been a discipline. But grief had locked me into a small room of habit, and the Cellar Alliance began to unlock doors I had kept closed out of habit and fear. Safe, or as safe as a woman could be with a man hiding under her floorboard, there occurred a slow stitching of myself back together. I began to use the skills that had been Thomas's and mine in the way they were meant, to keep people healthy and to keep them fed. I had learned to set bones when a miner slipped, to brew bitter tea that could coax a fever back into a sleep, to apply comfrey and witch hazel poultices that eased inflammation. I applied those same practical ministrations to the man beneath my store. Gabriel had a bruised side and a cough that would trouble him on windy nights. I poured him tisanes and scraped away the grit in the corners of his mouth. He would wince, but he never complained, and he watched me as if cataloging not my pain, but my method. The shop began to change, the way a room changes when sunlight finds it, where before the shelves were merely stock, they now felt like armor. I reorganized the back room, tucked away things we might trade for information or help. Old bolts, a length of copper wire, a brass lantern that could be lit and left as a sign. I printed a fresh ledger page and wrote new entries. Coal, by the ton, trust, by the name. The physical act of writing took my anger and gave it shape. I plotted payment schedules and who would take crops on trust. I sat in my back office at night, pen in hand, and sometimes laid out a plan that made sense without the rattle of emotion. It was not only the shop that was being mended. I found friends in women who had watched my marriage fray and had chosen different attachments. Mary Hearn, whose husband had died in a fire, came every Thursday with a basket of kiln-dried bread and a fierce look for any man who thought a widow should be easy prey. Ruth Ingram, the school teacher, taught me to plan for more than survival, how to keep written records for land transfers, how to attest a witness. Dina, who ran the boarding rooms, vouched for me when a deputy asked suspicious questions about comings and goings. The solidarity of these women was steady as old oak. They brought gossip like medicine and left it where it could be brewed into action. When the town's women began to visit more often, it wasn't to coddle me. It was to check the pulse of our collective future. Gabriel watched the women with a mixture of curiosity and respect. He listened when Mary talked about mending a broken hinge and chimed in when Dina described the night's innkeepers. He learned the names of local midwives and the schedules of local coaches without once pretending he was anything he had not been, a man who had run from some things and toward others. His past was a river with stones that would catch anyone who stepped carelessly, but he did not wear his past as a banner. He wore it like a cloak he would be willing to leave in the cellar when the time came. As I took on more responsibility in the shop, I also began to make choices about our future. I ran numbers in the light of afternoon and decided that the mortgage could be adjusted if creditors took smaller payments over a longer time. I bargained with suppliers in a way that had been only a fantasy when Thomas was alive. I promised payment schedules and gave them jars of preserves in exchange for grace. "You are stubborn," Gabriel told me one night as I sorted the sacks. I laughed and poured him a cup of cocoa. "Stubborn keeps a woman alive," I said. "Optimism starves her." The more I did, the more I saw that my skills were not shrugged off by the world. They were needed and could be leveraged. A widow in Dry Creek could be invisible or indispensable. I chose to be the latter. I began to use the store not only as commerce but as information, the place where farmers exchanged truth for flour, where a teacher paid her dues in pencils and advice. We used this network. When I needed a wagon to carry a load too large for my lean-to horse cart, I called on Jim Hallow, who owed me for sugar and who respected a woman who paid her debts with punctuality. When I needed a safe place to stash a box of nails out of sight, Ruth offered the schoolhouse privy in a flash of humor. Each small ask was a stitch in a larger quilt. Healing is not a sudden invention. It is a stringing of small acts that add up. One afternoon, when a storm blew cold and the lanterns browned with wind, I sat on the step of the stoop and let the rain run across my apron. I thought of Thomas. My fingers remembered the crease of his coat, and I did not feel shame at remembering. I felt the steadier warmth of a woman who had been forged by trials, but had not been undone by them. Gabriel sat beside me then. He had climbed the ladder and brought a blanket, and he did not try to fill the silence with heroics. He simply drew his knees to his chest and spoke in that economical way that acted a measure of respect. "You keep this town together," he said. "You could keep 100 towns if you let yourself." It was neither flattery nor guesswork. It was an observation. That night, the sugar tins felt heavier and more promising than before. I had a plan for payments, for bartering, for the slow reclamation of the apple tree's orchard. I also had a man under my floorboards who had proven himself competent, patient, and resourceful. We were no longer merely a woman protecting a fugitive. We were an alliance, newly minted and precarious, built from common need and from the slow recognition that each of us had useful skills the other lacked. I was learning to stand on my own, not by excluding help, but by accepting the kind that respected my agency. Gabriel had become something I could use. Not a rescue and not a threat, but a partner in survival. That choice would prove momentous when Harrow raised his voice and when the town decided to test whether a widow could be a fortress. Gabriel's past hung between us like an old coat, worn, familiar, and full of pockets. He did not hide his history because secrecy seemed cowardly to him. He revealed it because it mattered to our planning. He had been on the wrong side of a few laws and on the right side of a few causes. He had learned how to read men's gait, how to open locks without making a sound, how to make a story plausible and then leave no proof of its truth. Those were not virtues for a lady to put to use in polite company, but they were useful tools when Harrow's reach aimed at the throat of the town. I had my own knowledge of the town's soft points. As the storekeeper, I knew who could be bought with a sack of corn and who would hold out for coin. I knew which deputy had a fondness for the same woman nightly in the boarding house, and which clerk at the registry kept his ledgers with slovenly fingers. These were soft places to press, and together we found seams where Harrow's iron fist could be loosened. Gabriel's skill with hands and my skill with names became a dangerous and fruitful partnership. He showed me how to take a document and make its signature seem blotched by an honest clerk's quill. I showed him how the market accepted a small discount in the spring for the promise of a larger payment in the fall. We learned from each other as equals, and the town began to feel our influence like a tremor. There was a meeting at the Black Stallion, the inn that served both stew and rumor, where Harrow sat with his capricious smile and a ledger of his own. He loved the sound of coins and the silence of men who feared losing them. When he accused me of hiding an outlaw, I did not tremble. I stood behind the counter like a woman who had the right to be there, and steadier than I expected, made my case without pleading. "No man slept in my house," I said. If someone came and went, they came and left as customers. Harrow's selectors, men he had bought and polished for such days, took their cues from him. They blinked when I spoke plainly, and without distraction. Gabriel watched from the shadow of a door and then, with a gentleness that was startling given his past, stepped forward with a witness who had seen nothing. He did not need to lie. Instead, he used the truth like a blade, precise, unexpected, cutting the rope Harrow had intended to hang me with. The ways his outlaw life helped me were small and practical. He taught me how to keep a false trail so that a deputy would chase a story into the hills rather than into my back office. He taught me how to listen to the rhythm of horse hooves and tell not just who rode into town, but why. He had the stamina to ride the roads at night to gather information. Letters, a ledger, the names of debtors who had been coerced into signing away land they didn't own. In exchange, I taught him to read the finer details of a deed, to know the difference between a forged signature and one penned by a trembling hand. I taught him how to barter with Mrs. Klein for a blanket and to respect the space of a woman who was not asking for pity. Our trades were not romantic gestures. They were the currency by which we would buy each other's futures. At the center of my anger and of my plan was the revelation that Harrow had not merely been opportunistic. He had been active. A series of falsified liens, a judge with too much drink, and a ledger that smelled of bribe money. These were not accidents. Thomas had not died because of a cart accident. The wheel had been cut. Someone had taken the easy route of blame and made it a simple story. The truth is a heavier thing than a lie because it requires someone to lift it. Gabriel's knowledge of people who lied with smooth tongues and his talent for tracing them gave us breathing room. He knew how to scare a man into telling the right version of events. He could put a document where a greedy deputy could not resist it, then watch the man, with all his self-importance, confess to the convenience of a bribe. We used these skills to gather allies subtly. The blacksmith, Tom Hearn, had been reluctant to speak against Harrow. Tom owed the man money, and Harrow liked owing men to keep them pliant. Gabriel found a ledger entry in Harrow's clerk's handwriting that hinted at an illegal loan, and then left it where a sober-minded man like Tom would discover it. It took a sober-minded man to see injustice as a thing that infected his own shop. The blacksmith's testimony, once coaxed from his pride, became a key in the lock of evidence. Small revelations began to gather like rain, and Harrow's umbrella was not as strong as he thought. We never romanticized violence. The outlaw had done what he'd done and had consequences to answer for, but I learned that his cunning could serve a different end, mine. He respected my moral limits. We drew lines and agreed not to cross them. He would not kill to save me, and I would not ask him to. That constraint made our partnership honest. He offered a life turned toward restitution. I offered a life with purpose rather than the aimless mourn of a widow who shrank from the world. We each asked the other to be better. He would not force me. He would lead when I asked him to. I, in turn, took to the idea of offense for justice, rather than defense out of fear. The townspeople saw us gradually as a team, rather than as an odd coupling of necessity. Men who had been content trading in Harrow's coin started to look at the risks of alignment. Women who had watched me tend wounds and keep books now offered me dogged loyalty. Gabriel's reputation as an outlaw made some nervous. But when Tom the blacksmith swore in the market that Harrow had falsified the judge's ledger, the tide shifted toward truth. We were not just surviving anymore. We were forcing the town to reckon with the lie Harrow had built on. The outlaw who had hidden in my cellar had become an instrument, a skilled one, used to carve a path to justice. And in the process, he was learning how to be useful in a manner that restored, rather than destroyed. That change mattered to him as much as it mattered to me. We were both being remade by the work we needed to do. There is a particular clarity that comes with naming a wrong. It's one thing to have a ledger of small grievances. It's another to find the single rotten root that fed them. For months, I had nursed anger like a kept animal, feeding it small facts. A coerced signature, a deputy's silence, a judge who spent weekends with Harrow's ledger. But anger needs purpose. Without it, it's only a bitter thing that chews a woman herself. Naming Harrow's actions, calling them theft, murder by negligence, coercion, changed the timbre of my life. It made the stakes legible. Thomas's death no longer felt like an accident once I found the final note. It was tucked away in a clerk's margin and almost small enough to miss. But when I held the paper in the dead light of night, the letters looked like clues placed by a hand that wanted to be seen. There was a bill for a wheel repair the day before Thomas's ride, paid by a man who had no business touching the payment. The bill had been signed by a name that matched a deputy who was too fond of Harrow's company. That was the hinge that swung my grief into action. It was a legal hinge and a moral one. It meant that what was done to Thomas was intentional. And intention is a thing you can bring before a court or a congregation and ask to be judged. I found, in naming the wrong, that I was not alone. The town had been fed smaller humiliations for years. Farmers with liens they couldn't read, women with their votes ignored in the town meeting, laborers who lost wages because of accidents. Each had a petty story. Each had an injury that stitched into a pattern. The rage that had been secret in my ledger found a chorus in these small lives. Women started bringing me their own bills and notes to be read. They trusted me with their petty cruelties because they knew I would do something scrupulously simple. I'd read, I'd note what was wrong, and I'd figure out who benefited from that wrong. I decided I wanted justice, not vengeance. There is a difference. Justice demands that the truth be seen and that restitution be made. Vengeance is a private satisfaction that eats the giver. I wanted Harrow to be recognized for what he'd done, and I wanted the town to reclaim its dignity. It was a plan that required patience, cunning, and allies. Gabriel had the cunning. The women had the patience and the grit. The key was turning the town's small truths into a coherent argument, a petition, a set of witnesses, and an observable trail of money and motive. The plan came together slowly and in teacups. Ruth, the teacher, wrote statements in a careful, legible hand that could be read aloud in court. Mary swore by the smell of a certain kind of rope that she had seen men moving crates the night Thomas died. Dina borrowed a wagon and ferried us to a man named Ellis who ran a repair shop and who confessed, under a polite pressure applied by Gabriel, that he had gone and replaced a spoke in the wheel with a weaker one at Harrow's whisper. These were not theatrical confessions. They were the small, ugly recounting of a town's complicity. It took time to make them sound like something more than gossip. It took resolve to get witnesses to the meeting where they would swear before a clerk. Harrow did not go quietly. He brought the town's money to bear and tried to tighten the screws. Threats whispered at bar rooms, a legal notice here, a deputy's heavy hand there. He tried to intimidate the women who came forward. He dangled debts in front of the blacksmith and made sure the innkeeper had him for favors. His reach was as predictable as the shadow of the mill at noon, but our small network had begun to understand another thing, that fear could be shared. Harrow could threaten one woman and silence her, but he could not threaten a dozen who had nothing left to lose. There was a risk in each step we took. When I rode into the county seat to file the petition, accompanied by Ruth and Gabriel, I felt exposed in a way that was almost surgical. We pulled a small dossier together, ledgers, statements, and a diagram of the wheel repair, pointing to a man who had been paid in gold coin the evening before Thomas's death. The clerk at the courthouse was a thin man who looked at us as if surprised that a woman could file something so precise. He assumed we were emotional and would melt into tears the moment a man with a better suit spoke. Instead, Gabriel and I arranged the papers as if they were part of a business transaction, and Ruth read out the depositions in a voice like a bell. The clerk, who had been used to a certain theatricality, nodded and filed away our pieces with a small respect he had not meant to show. The document would not be enough. The justice system is slow in the best of times, and corruptible when men like Harrow can buy a delay. But the filing mattered. It was a tangible manifestation of my refusal to be silent. The petition made it possible for others to speak. It made the deputy who had taken bribes feel vulnerable for the first time. It made Harrow smile a little tighter. I felt weary and exhilarated in equal measures, as if I had been lifting a stone and finally seen the grave beneath it. Gabriel never asked me to soften my anger. He never told me to be less fierce. He only reminded me to be precise. "Anger is fire," he said once as we sat at the back of the shop writing witness statements. "Fire will warm you or burn you. Carry it carefully." The image stuck. I carried the fire and I carried the papers. I had been broken by circumstance, yes, but that fracture had not left me unformed. I was reshaping myself around purpose. I would not let the law be a tool for Harrow, nor would I let my grief fester into bitterness. I wanted the town to be mended and for Thomas's name to be cleared. I wanted a place to stand that was my own, not a bench for a man's insolence. There were nights I woke to thoughts of what we would do if the court failed us. There were nights when I felt I had asked too much of the women who rallied, of Gabriel, who placed himself at my side. But those nights were fewer than the mornings when I woke to the ledger's promise and the feel of the pen in my hand. The fight had become mine to lead, and I had chosen it. In choosing, I was no longer only a widow. I was an agent of cause and consequence. I would find out, in short order, how badly Harrow would respond when a woman refused to be small. Planning with Gabriel was like learning a new language that used old, necessary words. We spoke in inventory and in routines. Our strategizing sessions often started in the shop at dusk, the counter clearing the way for maps and ledgers as we pried open possibilities like tins. I would place a pencil beside the ledger and point to a line. He would point to a hinge. We married my financial acumen to his streetcraft and built a strategy that neither of us could have devised alone. We divided responsibilities to make our plan efficient. I became the public face, the ledger holder, the one who filed papers, the one who gathered testimony and spoke plainly at town meetings. Gabriel took the quieter jobs, following a deputy's trail to a tavern where a bribe might be revealed, removing a page from Harrow's ledger to be substituted with a copy that showed payments for labor rather than for favors. I trusted him with keys and secrets, and in turn, I taught him how to present evidence in a way that would make a clerk raise an eyebrow not in suspicion of the messenger, but in conviction of the message. Our partnership was cemented by mutual teaching. One evening, when the sun burnt low and the store warmed with the residual heat of the day, I taught Gabriel how to run a simple balance sheet. Assets, I said, are more than goods. I wrote the word slowly and underlined it. He watched as I categorized trust and credit lines. He asked questions about the town's seasonal cycles and about which farmers sold early in drought. In return, he taught me how to read a man's gait into his mood, how to tell when a deputy's polite smile covered fear, not arrogance. We swapped terms, profit for pursuit, cost for cover. Neither of us had been offered this kind of equal exchange before. He had known men who wanted to command or be commanded. I had known men who mistook kindness for weakness. Together we were learning the art of mutuality. Romance, such as it is, in a life filled with strategy and risk, brushed against us in practical ways. The attraction was not feverish. It was pragmatic and tender. We found comfort in small, domestic moments. He would bring me a boiled egg without asking for thanks. I would mend a torn sleeve. We shared silence at first, long, comfortable silences like rooms we were both furnishing, and then small confessions. He spoke of a sister he'd left in another county and a regret that tasted of manure and laughter. I spoke of Thomas, of how his laughter had filled the rafters at Christmas. There were moments when our hands touched over a ledger and we both paused, as if startled that the touch fit so easily into our plans. The partnership rippled outwards. Other women began to accept roles that were not only supportive but also strategic. Mary and Ruth organized a rotation to keep an eye on the store during the nights I had to be in town filing papers. Dina arranged a schedule with the boarding house so that our watchers were believed. They did not see themselves as helping me alone. They saw themselves as investing in a collective future where a widow could retain a shop without being prey to a tycoon. It was solidarity that looked a lot like practical scheduling and bartered goods, bread for attestations, mending for testimony. In one of our planning sessions, Gabriel showed me how to use a false ledger to tempt Harrow into a trap. "You need to bait him," he said. "Nothing scents a man like greed." The trap would involve a ledger entry that made Harrow think he'd won a small victory, an apparent account that promised he would be the beneficiary of a crooked payment. If he bit, he would reveal more of his methods than the law might otherwise extract. I thought about the ethics of baiting a man into his own downfall. I thought about whether the means sanctified the end. I decided that it did, because Harrow had used his means against us for years. This was not vengeance. It was a rerouting of a habit he had practiced. As we plotted, we also healed. Gabriel's confession of the softer parts of himself, of the boy he once had been, mollified some of the ugliness of his past. He was not without flaw. He could be brusque, impatient when things did not move at the speed his memories demanded. I too had my imperfections. I could be stubborn to the point of folly, and I could wear my grief like armor until it became rust. But we learned the art of correction without humiliation. When one of us faltered, when Gabriel's temper blazed, or when I let fear close my mouth, the other would speak a gentle truth, not a judgment. It was a partnership formed in the fires of necessity, but tempered by the simple habit of respect. We practiced rescue and restraint. There were nights Gabriel would circle the town and come back with gossip like a man returning from market. He taught me how to listen to the cadence of a sheriff's knock and how to count the number of men in Harrow's crew by the weight of their boots on the boardwalk. I showed him how to say no to a creditor who thought he could charm a woman into signing away her land. Together we rehearsed scenarios. If Harrow took the store by writ, how would we protect the ledger? If he put pressure on the judge, how would we bring witnesses forward? The answers were practical and often dull. Move the ledger, rearrange debts, hold a town meeting, and above all, hold for the truth. There were tender evenings when we would cook together for the women who came to confer. These were simple things: dried beans, a stew thickened with barley, a pie with apples from Thomas's tree when the season allowed. The act of cooking together felt like a promise. It was a way of making sustenance for the town and for ourselves. It was also an intimate, equal space, hands working side by side, neither one taking the lead, but both contributing. Gabriel would slice wood with a whittled knife, and I would stir quietly, giving him the room to talk. The talk was not always about the law. Sometimes it was about small absurdities: who had stained their new shirt last Sunday, who had told a joke that made a clerk bluster. These domestic moments made a scaffold for our partnership: protection, planning, affection. As the day of reckoning drew closer, we both knew things would be asked of us that would test our agreement. Would I ask him to do something that broke my moral line? Would he ask me to hide his past? The answer, we promised each other, would be no. We had crafted a compact of mutual respect. His hands would be used for defense that restored rather than destroyed, and my authority would be absolute in matters of the store and of the town's welfare. In that balance, we found not only effectiveness, but a kind of love that neither of us sought but both of us treasured. It was not an ending we had planned when the writ first came to my door. It was a beginning we could now imagine, of a life stitched together by competence and choice. There are moments in a life where a choice is less between two options than between two futures. Mine arrived on a bright morning when the light cut the shelves into sharp, honest angles, and the writ still lay under the counter like an accusation. Harrow had sent another notice, a sheriff's recheck to serve more paperwork, to make sure the town remembered who held the majority of the planks. He had also sent men to ransack a neighboring farm as a show of force. The message was clear: surrender and live quietly, or resist and invite escalation. I could have slipped away. I could have sold the store or signed over the deed to Harrow's men in exchange for a smaller, quieter penance. The town would have forgiven me. The ledger would have closed and the world would have gone on. But this particular morning, the world felt too small for the sort of compromise that would leave another woman with a writ the next year and another widow silent. I had worked too long and too hard, and Thomas's ledger, those neat columns of trust, demanded something steadier than capitulation. Gabriel understood this. which is why he sat at the back of the shop with a map spread on an overturned barrel and watched me watch the door. He watched with the kind of respect that recognizes a woman making a decision. He spoke, not with the commanding flint he sometimes used with others, but softly. "You get to choose, Clara." His voice was not a plea for me to take a safer path. He did not try to steer me, but a reminder that the choice belonged to me, always. He had never sought to own me. He had come into my life as a resource, and stayed as a man who respected my agency. We sat and imagined, carefully. There was a future in which I sold and started again, perhaps in a town with a better law and less appetite for men like Harrow. There was a future where I fought and tired, and possibly lost everything except the small bones of dignity. There was also a future where we brought the town together, drew the truth out into the open, and forced a remedy that was both public and regenerative. We considered the children in Dry Creek. If any of them grew up watching a widow sign away, land at a man's whim, what would that teach them? We considered the women who visited my shop every day, who brought bread and witness statements, who had begun to believe in collective action. The daydream was brief but potent, a life where the shop ran under our careful watch, where Gabriel could step back from a life on the run, and I could stop counting threats and sleepless nights. The sweeter image was not about rescue, though. It was about a partnership where we both chose to be anchored. I imagined mornings where he would lean against the counter and plan a fix for the harness while I tallied sugar sacks. It was not a fantasy of being completed. It was one of being matched, of being someone whose strengths were mirrored and complemented. I imagined a small house behind the store where, perhaps, I would plant more apple saplings and Gabriel would teach me how to trim branches so the tree did not break in storm season. But imagining and choosing are different acts. The real test was risk. We could shield ourselves by laying low, by quietly moving ledgers and hiding evidence. We could buy legal delays, hire lawyers of questionable ethics, and run the clock. That would be safer. Or we could press the matter, call a town meeting, present our evidence, and invite a public hearing. It would mean exposing more than Harrow's wrongdoing. It would mean exposing the town's complicity and testing whether the town wanted justice or the easy veneer of peace. At noon, the church bell tolled and a crowd gathered because towns are like that. They crave theater. Harrow came in with his clever smile and a deputy with eyes like the color of old curses. He expected me to flinch. He expected a woman to offer him the simple kindness of surrender. Instead, I called for a meeting. The time to make decisions in private had passed. I took the ledger from its biscuit tin and placed it on the counter where anyone could see. The leather felt heavy in my hands, the weight of words and memories, but I set it down with a kind of calm that surprised even me. Ruth read the affidavits. Mary stood to confirm the rope story. Tom the blacksmith spoke with a sudden courage that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The crowd listened, some incredulous, others bored, some quietly hoping to be entertained. Gabriel watched me from where he stood in the doorway, and I met his gaze and felt a steadying force within myself. The choice had been public now, and with it, my responsibility. The deputy's face hardened. Harrow's smile thinned. He called the meeting a circus, an affront to civility. He tried his old tricks, appeals to townsfolk who had paid him in favor, and the kind of reasoning that thinks money can make everything reasonable. But there was a discernible shift. Once truth is put under lamplight, it is harder to pretend that a shadow is sunlight. People around the room began to murmur, not at me, but at Harrow's ledger as if it were a magician's trick revealed. When the meeting ended, the sheriff did not arrest Harrow. The law is rarely immediate, but the ledger, the testimonies, and the public airing had changed the calculus. Harrow could no longer pretend he was merely a businessman. He was now a man with visible opponents. I had chosen to press for justice rather than to retreat. I had chosen my future, and I had chosen a partner who respected that I made the choice. That night, as we closed the shop and the bell's last echo hung in the air, Gabriel took my hand lightly. "Whatever happens," he said, "I am with you." It was not a claim of ownership. It was a pledge of support. I squeezed back. I had chosen a path that would likely demand more than I had planned, but I had chosen it because I was not, and would not be, quiet. The moment of choice had been mine. I had lifted the ledger and called the town to account. The next storm would be loud, and it would come with men who did not like being exposed. We would meet it, together, and on my terms. After the meeting, the air in Dry Creek tightened like a drum. Harrow's patience had snapped into a sort of furious choreography. He brought men, some hired, some bought, and he strategized petty cruelties meant to intimidate. A young deputy with more nerve than sense began to shadow my shop. A merchant who had once offered me a friendly loan started calling in overdue accounts another day earlier than agreed. Harrow sent letters with thin veils of legal menace, and his hired hands prowled the boardwalk at dusk. He understood that law turned public spectacle into private gain, and he meant to use it. The town, which had enjoyed a quiet peace under his hand, suddenly felt the sickly smell of a storm. Additionally, men from Gabriel's old life began to stir. The man in the posters, the vengeful gang that had made a name out of chasing Calloway, had allies in unexpected places, a captain who had been slighted years earlier by Gabriel's band, and a clan who trusted blood more than ledger. Their presence shifted the danger's geometry. Harrow's men were a civic menace, operating under a veneer of legality. Gabriel's old enemies were a raw threat, willing to set fire to a building if it meant extracting a man. Those two forces, one legal and one lawless, began to conspire in ways that threatened not just me and my store, but the fragile peace of the town. Word traveled, and not all of it was accurate. Rumors exaggerated Gabriel's role into the sort of thriller the town loved, that the hideous outlaw had a score to settle and would use Dry Creek as his base. It was the sort of story that frightened some and thrilled others. People looked at us differently, some with support, others with suspicion. But the women who had rallied before held firm. Mary and Ruth were present more than ever, bringing meals and keeping lists of who had said what. They formed a network of eyes, and the shields they offered were pragmatic. Schedules, watch shifts, and warnings whispered before a man came too close. One afternoon, a cart smashed the post of my neighbor's fence. Harrow's men had trashed the property to rattle me. It was a message: give up, or this will be you. The deputy who gave the notice had a face like a man who enjoys his power. He did not know how to read a woman's ledger the way I did. He did not understand that a ledger's quiet resistance is not always the loudest weapon. After the cart incident, we spent the night in planning. Gabriel, who had been a shadow and an advisor, suggested contingency plans that were tactical. We rehearsed signals. A single lantern left burning in a window meant the women should come to the back, while 3 knocks in a particular rhythm told them to fetch the weapons stashed prudently in the barn behind Dina's boarding house. I learned to map the town not as a woman who kept the store, but as a strategist. We placed women in positions where they could see Harrow's men moving the goods he intended to seize. We made a chain of communication using the postman's route and the doctor's calls. It was not romantically heroic. It was practical and necessary. The more we prepared, the more confident the women became. They learned to throw a rope, to whistle discreetly, to get the pitch of a lie out of a man's voice. There was a particular pride in teaching Mary how to disassemble a musket and then reassemble it by memory. She took the learning home like a new tool. But complicating this was the greater peril of Gabriel's past. One night, men came and burned a pile of calloused timber at the edge of town. It was a message from the outlaw's enemies: we will not be contained. They wanted to make him look weak, and they wanted the town to fear harboring him. Harrow saw in that a chance to tighten the screws. He claimed it was proof that harboring an outlaw endangered the town. The argument was seductive to those who wanted to go back to a simpler order. Fear is the fastest route back to submission. The town's mood was a weather vane quickly turning with the wind. My personal risk increased. The sheriff sent a deputy with instructions to take the ledger and bring in witnesses for questioning. It meant exposing my women's network to interrogation. It meant putting Mary, Ruth, and Dina in the position of answering for their loyalty. I could have hidden. I could have moved the ledger and sent Gabriel away, but the choice had already been made. I had called the town to account, and I had an obligation to the women who believed in me. We had to hold our ground. The night before the siege, because that is what it would become, we secured everything that mattered. We stashed the ledger in a hollowed-out book and buried it beneath sacks of dried beans that we had always kept for the winter. We moved valuables to the schoolhouse, where a stout trunk could be locked and witnesses could be sworn in. Mary brought more blankets, and Dina brought pots for stew. Gabriel and I walked the perimeter. The wind made the apple tree groan. Its branches were bare but stubborn. It felt prophetic. "They'll come," he said simply. The words were not an alarm so much as an announcement. I stood at the store doorway and looked down the street. Men had come to town in small groups. Harrow's henchmen with legal papers, and then the darker men at the edge, those who had no patience for law at all. The two forces were like tides that would meet and create storm. But I also saw, in the windows along the street, the faces of women who had made their own choices. They had come with tools, and with courage. They had taken comfort in each other's competence. For the first time since Thomas's death, I felt something fierce and expansive grow in me. Not merely resolve, but a template for what could be built anew. Whatever the siege would demand, we had prepared. We were not innocent. We were ready. The morning the siege began, the sky was a flat pewter. The town's boardwalk that morning held faces I had known all my life, and faces I recognized from posters and past wrongs. Harrow's men came in formation, their mouths full of threats and their coats full of swagger. They carried a court writ, the kind meant to smear a man's property with the authority of paper. They expected me to break. The outlaw's enemies sat at a distance, watching, their intent like a cold wind that missed no visage. Initial skirmishes were small and cruel. Harrow's men attempted to lock the shop and seize goods in a flurry of paper and muscle. A deputy who had taken a bribe stepped forward with the authority of a man who had convinced himself that what he did was lawful. Gabriel's presence at my side kept the confrontation from tipping into immediate bloodshed. He stood in the doorway, his height a warning, and the men stalled. But the situation escalated when the deputy decided to search the upstairs rooms without warrant, and my Women Village Watch objected. For that protest, a hired hand shoved one of them. A small shove, but enough to send the message that resistance would be met by force. Then came the betrayal. I had always known Harrow had friends within the town. I had never imagined the ones who would turn. One of the men who ostensibly supported me, the man who fixed the pump and who I trusted with small repairs, offered the deputy an affidavit, an altered one, saying I'd given the outlaw shelter to plan a robbery. His handwriting had been doctored to include lies. I felt myself swing between fury and disbelief. The slap of betrayal landed like a physical thing. This man had been in my kitchen, had fixed my porch, had read my ledger upon request. He had chosen Harrow's coin. The betrayal unloosed consequences. The deputy, armed with the forged affidavit, moved with the law's sanction. Gabriel and I found ourselves cornered by paper that had the force of judicial language, and by men who had been paid to look the other way. Harrow upped the cost for my debts in public and announced that if I did not vacate the premises by sunset, he would have the sheriff move in. The town watched, some whispering, some cheering. The fallout was immediate. Customers vanished, fearing association. Credit lines closed. The store's pulse slowed to a faint thud. We had a plan for danger, but not for betrayal from someone we had trusted. The uncanny cruelty of it was that it cut through the solidarity like a blade. It meant that our network was not impermeable, and that fear could be sown in small, specific ways. The men who had been on the fringe of support were now useful vectors for Harrow's power. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Our darkest hour came that night. Under the thinness of the moon, Harrow's hired men returned, more numerous and angrier. They placed rough planks against the shop windows to barricade us inside, and then lit flares at the corners of the street. The intent was to isolate and intimidate. They wanted not just to scare us, but to starve us into compliance. The lights made everything appear unreal, as if the town had been staged for a play whose script was violence. Stone-faced men paced and called for the law to be done. The women gathered in the back room, and I saw for the first time what true courage looked like. It was not the swagger of men with guns. It was the quiet flipping of a sewing needle to make a hole for a bullet to pass. We equated courage with the mundane acts of survival: barrels emptied into basins for water, oil rationed, a roster written to keep watch. Gabriel moved between the cellar and the loft with a steady competence, his face drawn in the way someone who cares might be. He cleaned weapons with a focus that made my heart tight. He was not reveling in the fight. His eyes showed the cost he'd already paid in other towns. Betrayal widened its reach. The man who had signed the false affidavit turned up at the back of the shop, furious when he saw the plan for resistance. He tried to wrest the ledger from my hands. It was a small, desperate attempt. One man trying to erase his complicity with a show of strength. Mary stepped forward and struck him with a rolling pin. He went down with a surprised curse. The sight of it, one woman defending another, felt like a small bell ringing in my bones. It was a crude act, but it said what words could not. We would not be pushed without fight. I had good reason to be afraid. The outlaw's enemies planned an attack that would look savage and sudden. Harrow's legal attacks would press at dawn. The rough men at the town's edge would press at night. We were trapped in the middle. I sat in the cellar that night, the ledger before me, and felt the weight of responsibility squeeze. The room smelled of sweat and the last of the stew, and I breathed in the presence of the women who had chosen to be present. I thought of Thomas's handwriting and the way he had made a world out of measurements. I thought of the apple tree and of the promise of a harvest that might not come. My hands curled around the pen as if a choice could be inked into being. When the worst came, when the first board went through the window, when a shot cracked in the alley, the world narrowed to the act of staying alive and staying true. I do not pretend heroics. I do not relish the violence of it. But in that cramped hour, I felt my fragility meet a sturdier truth. I could be frightened and still act. I had come far enough to know what I would protect, and I had women beside me who would stand. We answered fear not with surrender, but with strategy and stubbornness. In the cellar, the ledger lay like a sacred thing. I would hold it. We would hold each other. When the night finally folded and the attackers withdrew to lick their bruises, it was not because the law had decided to intervene. It was because a small town, with a stubborn widow in the center of it, had declared it would not be dismantled by violence and corruption. The bruise was deep, but it had not extinguished us. When the siege ebbed with the first falsified claim and the last thrown stone, the women and I did not celebrate. There was no triumphant music in a small shop after such strain. only the steady, necessary work of patching and planning. We tended to bruises, packed bandages, and took inventory of loss. A broken window, a splintered shelf, a few sacks of grain gone. But among the damage, something fundamental shifted. I had expected to be a subject of the story, a woman held in the grip of a contest between force and law. Instead, I found myself becoming the architect of the town's response. The rise was not sudden. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small choices: who to send for help, how to distribute food, where to plant the ledger's copies. I began to lead. I organized the town's women into a defense that was not reckless violence, but a strategic, disciplined blockade. We made supply runs under cover of smoke to move valuables to trusted locations. We trained in basic defense, the way a midwife teaches a birth, with hands, repetition, and no flourish. Mary taught knot tying. Ruth taught the art of quietness. Dina organized the rotas for who would mind the boarding house and who would watch for Harrow's men. Gabriel offered tactical counsel, and I converted it into a logistics plan. Our tactics were cunning as any of Harrow's. We used the town's architecture, the narrow alleys, the overhanging awnings, the creek bridge, as a theater to funnel Harrow's men into positions where they would be seen and confronted by townsfolk. We used light and sound to create a presence far greater than our numbers. We arranged for stories to leak to the county seat about Harrow's heavy hand. We banked on the possibility that exposure would bring legal attention. When the day came for a final confrontation, a planned stand in the square where Harrow intended to take the deed by force, we met him with a crowd that had been organized, coached, and sworn to the truth. If the world expects a woman to be a victim and a man to be the rescuer, let me be clear. I was the organizer of our defense, the one who decided the place and the time. Gabriel stood at my shoulder like a lieutenant who recognized his general. Other women stood with us, arm in arm with children and with men who had finally chosen a side. The plan was to expose Harrow publicly, present the evidence, and let the law be what it might. If Harrow wanted violence, we would not cower. If he wanted legal theater, we would perform a better play. The square smelled of dust and courage. Harrow arrived with his men, his face set like a carved thing meant to intimidate. He tried once more to be charming, to laugh at the audacity of a widow who thought she could run a fight. I walked forward, a woman with the ledger carefully carried like a relic in a cloth, and open witnesses at my back. Ruth read the affidavit that proved Harrow's financial manipulations. Tom the blacksmith, who had seen the false rope, testified, and the clerk at the county seat, who had finally been convinced by the persistent case we put together, arrived and read the charges. The first major shift came when the very landowner Harrow had bought the judge's silence from stood up. He had been persuaded by evidence and by fear of association now that facts were public. He owned a small parcel of land, and when Harrow called him to swear false things, he instead affirmed the truth. It was a small, official thing that made a monstrous difference. The sheriff could not ignore public testimony when local businessmen stepped backward from their patron. The law rarely moves as quickly as righteousness, but it is fierce when driven by a community. When Harrow realized the town had turned, his resolve crumbled into a last-ditch attempt to seize my ledger by force. He lunged. Luke, a young man who had grown up in the boarding house and who once came to fetch sugar, stepped between us and took Harrow's fist like a shield. The scuffle that followed was ugly and swift. Men shoved and pushed like a tavern brawl. I did not fight with a man's fists. I used my words, my witnesses, and my authority. I named the ledger's entries aloud, item by item, and it sounded less like accounting than like justice. People around me were not spectators, but participants. Women, those I had taught, and those who had learned on the fly, moved with determined, quiet force. They used slingshots and stones to knock weapons from hands. They used boiling water and the heavy iron ways that had once been used to press cloth to unnerve the aggressors. It was not an elegant war. It was a messy, human thing, but it worked. In the end, Harrow and his men, facing a united town and a stack of evidence, fled, their confidence broken by the surprise of female competence. When the last man ducked out of sight, the square fell into a heavy quiet and then into the soundless sound of people drawing breath. We had won not by the script of a man rescuing a woman, but by the careful orchestration of many people who decided to be brave in the way they had practiced. I looked at Gabriel then, and saw something like relief and pride wash over his face. He had been reborn into a life that did not require him to run, and I had become a woman whose leadership could steer a town. Victory did not come without cost. Some of the women were bruised. Tom the blacksmith's arm was bandaged. We had lost goods and had had shelves broken and windows shattered, but the ledger remained intact. More importantly, the town had been reminded that power could be wielded differently, by collective action rather than by singular domination. We had not only defended my store, we had rewritten a little of how Dry Creek understood its own politics. The apple tree in the yard afterward felt like a small prophet, its branches lifting as if in applause for a harvest that might yet come. We had risen because we had to, and we had done it together. I had transformed from a woman who had kept a shop to the woman who could keep a town honest. It was not a destiny I had sought, but a role I embraced with the patience and competence I had long cultivated. The world beyond our fence would continue to be harsh. There would be legal appeals and the long, slow work of reconstruction. But for the first time since Thomas's death, my future felt like something I could plot on a ledger, not merely surviving but thriving. And in that ledger, iron and ink, there was a new entry, one that would read like a promise. Clara Mercer, proprietor, neighbor, and the woman who would not be pushed aside. The aftermath of the square's confrontation was not a tidy courtroom drama, but a slow, insistent unraveling of a corrupt weave. Harrow had fled town with half his confidence, but with more enemies than he had bargained for. His henchmen were scattered and their loyalty cracked. The county, once shy of pressing charges against a wealthy man, began to notice the public testimony stacked against him. Ruth and I drove the matter forward with a persistence that a clerk could not procrastinate away. We turned our daily trade into a campaign of truth, one ledger entry at a time. Once the physical threat receded, the law took its measured course. Complaints were filed, affidavits were sworn, and a judge, one who had not been in Harrow's pocket, summoned him to answer for falsifying liens and for his role in Thomas's death. The case was not clean. The law rarely affords clear paths when the guilty are clever. But structure and evidence matter, and we had both. We presented witnesses who corroborated Ellis's admission about the faulty wheel repair. The clerk's ledger entries, once forged and altered, had been replaced with copies we had acquired through patient copying and a little of Gabriel's subtle ledger domain. The trials were long and sometimes maddeningly procedural. Harrow had the money for lawyers who could slow things down, who could file motions and make the judicial clock run like molasses. I learned the tedium of jurisprudence, how to wait for a subpoena like one waits for rain in a drought. But the public record and the community's memory were not so easily altered. As the case progressed, we found allies who had been too frightened to speak at first now writing statements of support. The blacksmith, the innkeeper, and that former handyman, the one who had signed a false affidavit, each had their moments of reckoning. Some recanted, some confessed, and some faced penalties for their earlier complicity. Gabriel's redemption was not a dramatic conversion. It was a series of choices that kept tending toward restitution. He testified, not with confession only, but with a measured accounting of the past. He told the court who the men in his old gang were and how things had soured, information that helped the sheriff arrest a few of Harrow's hired hands who had committed worse crimes in our region. He did not lie to make himself smaller or better. He simply told the truth of his part in what had occurred. In doing so, he cleaned some of his history through the slow work of telling and being accountable. The crucial morning came with a sense of gravity that felt like a Bible measured in ink. The judge read the charges, the clerk called witnesses, and I stood at the front of the room with the ledger in my hands like a relic. I did not speak melodramatically. I spoke plainly, listing entries, stating what I had observed, and pointing to the corroborating testimonies. The room, full of people I had known since childhood and strangers who had come to watch a saga unfold, stayed silent. It felt like the sound of a wheel turning. When the verdict came, it was not a blinding vindication so much as a careful acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Harrow was fined, and his ability to hold certain properties was curtailed. The judge's sentence included restitution to those who had been defrauded, small reparations, but the principle mattered. More importantly, several of Harrow's closest cronies were indicted for participating in the falsification of legal documents. The judge, choosing to make an example, required that local property records be audited and corrected. It would take time, but the remediation process began. I had fought for Thomas not only as a man, but as a principle. Having the law acknowledge wrongdoing was less than a restoration and more than an apology. It was a public validation that the record mattered. The ledger, Thomas's care for names and numbers, had not been a decorative memory. It had been a tool by which truth could be established. The fact that the town's record-keeping had been altered by a man with money was less an isolated happening than an indictment of a system. We brought light to the blink of darkness that had been Harrow's influence. The romantic thread, which some in towns like to dramatize as the heart of such tales, remained rooted in equity and shared healing. Gabriel and I did not exchange vows and sweep the town in a day. Our relationship grew in careful confidence. We participated in the legal process together and in the domestic work at the store. He repaired a rafter in the back room, and I balanced the final accounting entries. He continued to make restitution by aiding in the recovery of misappropriated goods, and he worked with the sheriff to find and detain men who had committed violent acts under Harrow's orders. He was not redeemed by me. He redeemed himself through consistent, accountable acts. The townswomen, Mary, Ruth, Dina, were part of this victory in ways that were visible and unsung. They continued to run the network that had kept the store supplied and kept the town informed. They were witnesses in court, auditors of records, and caretakers of the practical details of daily life. Their contributions could not be overstated. Their presence in the courtroom, steady and unflinching, helped make our case morally hard to refute. After the court's rulings and the gradual return of customers, the shop regained its rhythm. People who had disappeared from the market trickled back, noting quietly the changes and the new names on deeds. The apple tree in the yard, somehow, seemed to have more leaves after the first frost retreated. We mended the shelves with a care not merely to repair but to make them stronger. I set a new policy of records transparency for the town's transactions and offered to help teach other women how to record debts and protect land titles. It felt like a small revolution. Women now had the capacity to protect their property, to read a deed, and to call witnesses. Justice, in its truest form, is rarely perfect. Harrow still had power and money in pockets beyond our view. The law had caught him but had not torn the root of corruption from every crevice in the county. But the town had been taught a lesson that would be harder to forget, that a woman's ledger could topple a man's fortune when wielded with care and community. We had not only saved my store, we had made a precedent, quiet but sturdy. The romance between Gabriel and me settled into a companionable partnership, shared chores, shared plans, and a quiet understanding that we had chosen to build a life together, not because one had completed the other, but because together we were stronger. A year later, Dry Creek felt different. The boardwalk still creaked, and dust still settled in the same corners, but the rhythm had altered. My sign, Merger & Co., hung steady and clean from a newly repaired post. I woke with purpose, not roving anxiety, and planned for more than weather and threats. The store was busier in a good way. Farmers brought grain with a nod, children came for penny candy, and women came to consult the ledger as if it were scripture. I taught a small weekly class, Rural Bookkeeping for Women, where Ruth and Mary and I showed women how to record debts, how to read deeds, and how to witness a transaction. The classroom was the back room above the storeroom, and its chairs were patched but full of ambition. Gabriel and I kept our partnership practical and affectionate. He had long ago stopped sleeping in the cellar and had a modest room behind the shop where he kept a box of things he said reminded him of a life both loved and left. He taught me to trim apple trees, and I taught him how to balance a ledger. We argued about small things, how to price eggs in a tight market, whether to plant more fruit trees, and we laughed about them. When the months made gentler demands on us both, we would sit on the stoop and watch the town go by, trading soft commentary on the characters whose comings and goings had once seemed like weather events. Our relationship had none of the romantic gloss that tidy stories claim. It was a mutual work of respect, attraction, and shared goals. Financial independence, which had once been a precarious ledger entry, was now visible. The store, under careful stewardship, had regained value. The mortgage situation had been renegotiated through patient payments and occasional barter. I purchased an adjacent small lot with a down payment that felt like a victory, a roofed shed for grain and a place to store tools. It meant I had property in my own name, not in trust, and that my future was not subject to the whim of a man with more money. The apple tree had saplings under it now, and when I planted a new row, I thought of Thomas in a way that was softer and less sharp. Women's solidarity remained a foundational part of the town's life. The bookkeeping class spun off into a small cooperative where women pooled resources for larger purchases: seed, a millstone, a new roof. In the evenings, we gathered at Dina's boarding house to knit and to plan. Some projects were practical, others political, like petitioning the county for better roads. We had tasted what it meant to be a community that could defend itself, and we wanted to be a town that could thrive together. Our little cooperative would ensure no widow stood alone again. As for Harrow, he was diminished but not erased. Legal measures had curtailed his ability to operate within the county as smoothly as before. He had lost land and influence, and some properties were returned to those who had been defrauded. It was slow and never complete. There would always be men who tried to purchase quiet and men willing to sell it. But the precedent we set of a woman taking her place in the civic ledger was powerful. People began to cite our case as an instance of small-town resistance, a lesson in accountability that traveled through messenger and wagons as surely as seed did. Gabriel, once an outlaw who hid beneath my floor, became my partner in name and in practice. He had been offered an official pardon for his testimony and for aiding the sheriff. The county needed him to root out other violent men. He declined the flamboyant pardon that would have required a public confession of sins he preferred private, and instead accepted what mattered to him most: the chance to remain in town without the need to run. He worked openly, fixing harnesses, loaning a hand for harvest, and sometimes riding to the next county for supplies. His redemption was simple and earned. He was not perfect. He had faults, temper among them, but he was mine by choice, as I was his. Our romance was not the point of the story, and neither of us wanted it to be a tidy salve to the wounds of the past. It was, however, a relationship built on equality. We chose each other, and when we made that choice, it was from a place of mutual respect and grown strength. He had not rescued me, and I had not redeemed him by love. We rescued ourselves, together. As I stood beside the shop one crisp morning, looking over the bookkeeping class in session and friends repairing a fence in the distance, I felt the prickle of pride, a practical, earned pride. A woman in her late 30s who had once been told to sell and move on had become a figure who offered courses and counsel. The life I had built was not merely for me, it was a template for other women who wanted to root and thrive. I had become a force that could shape not only my destiny, but the destinies of those who would follow. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe that it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you've found your tribe. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings. Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms. Share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are. The sun slid low and the apple trees threw soft shade. The ledger was on the shelf, now a teaching tool. The shop bell still rang, and when it did, I looked up and met the faces of women and men who had learned that courage could be quiet, that love could be chosen, and that independence was a ledger to be balanced daily. We were not perfect, but we had something steadier. Each other. And that is the sort of legend worth telling.